My name is Mohammed Kimji. One of the most interesting parables in the Gospel of Matthew is the parable of the sower. It's in chapter 13. And I want to work through this parable with you because I think this is one of the moments where we get an explanation for why the text needs to be read figuratively in many instances. Here we have an instruction on why the reader has the obligation to distinguish between the letter and the spirit, to distinguish between saying and meaning, um, metaphor, a letter, a term, and the meaning of that term, or the the metaphor and the symbols and the meaning of the imagery. Um, so what I'm going to do is I just want to read to you the parable as found in chapter 13 of the Gospel of Matthew, and then I will make some comments. I'm going to start right at verse number 1. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Then the disciples came and asked him, Why do you speak to them in parables? Okay, let's stop here for a moment. Here you find a parable that on the surface is about agriculture. You have a sower. A sower is a seed planter. And the sower plants seeds in different places or drops seeds in different places. The sower drops seeds on the path, but those seeds don't grow into anything. The birds simply come and eat them up. Other seeds are dropped on rocky ground. Nothing grows there because there is no depth of soil. Other seeds fall in thorns, but nothing grows there. They're choked out by the thorns. But when the seeds fall in good soil, you have plenty of growth. You have fruits, you have vegetables, you have good things coming out of the ground because there is sufficient depth of soil. Now, we know that the parable is to be interpreted because Jesus ends at verse number 9, let anyone with ears listen, which tells you that there's a difference between having ears and listening. There's a difference between hearing, you can say, through the ears, and understanding. And so everyone has heard what Jesus has said. The sound waves have carried, but not everyone will understand. And we know that not everyone will understand because the disciples seem not to understand. And later they ask, why do you speak in parables? And later they will ask, what is the meaning of the parable? So I'm just trying to make sure that that's what they say here. Okay, so the disciples don't ask for the meaning of the parable, but Jesus will explain the meaning of the parable. But I think that the parable about the sower is a parable about why you speak in parables, why Jesus speaks in parables. And what is he communicating? Well, when clearly the sower is the teacher, and the seeds that are dropped are his teaching. And so when the seeds fall on the pathway, the birds come and eat them up because the pathway does not contain the soil that is necessary for the seeds to grow. When the seeds drop on the pathway, that signifies that the word is just immediate. It doesn't. It's understood literally. There is no meaning outside of the word, outside of what is said. So there is no depth of interpretation. There is no depth of understanding. So the pathway represents the heart or the ears that are not receptive to the meaning of what is said. So it's a very immediate understanding of what is said. What the person says is what he means. There's no difference between saying and meaning. It's kind of like somebody who simply looks at you and makes a judgment about you. There's no attempt to understand who you are. Just on the basis of what the person sees with the eyes, the person makes an immediate judgment. And that person has no depth of relationship. And so nothing can grow out of that relationship. Well, in this particular case, the words that hit the ears, they are received immediately and they are understood at a very superficial level, which means that there is no real understanding. There's no attempt to understand what is communicated by the words. The words itself are the communication. And so the letter is not distinguished from the spirit. And in that case, nothing's going to grow. So this is represented by the birds coming and eating up the seeds because the individual takes the teaching, but doesn't take time to understand it, to think about it, to engage with it through effort, and thus nothing productive can come from it. What one hears is what the thing is, and that's it. And this is how Jesus's accusers actually in the gospel are represented. The Pharisees and the scribes and the experts in the law in general, and the religious hierarchy in general, are represented as not hearing, understanding what Jesus is saying. They see Jesus to be violating the law of the Hebrew scriptures, whereas from Jesus's standpoint, he is defending the spirit of the scriptures. So while he might be in violation of the word of the law, as for example, when he is working on the Sabbath, picking grain on the Sabbath with his disciples because they are hungry, and they are accused of working on the Sabbath. From Jesus's point of view, this is entirely consistent with the Sabbath because the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. The law has validity insofar as it is good for human beings. That's why the law is true, because it serves human beings in a positive way. Well, in this parable, some seeds fall on rocky ground, but there's no depth of soil. And when there's no depth of soil, they get scorched and there's no root and they wither away. So once again, in order for something to grow, there has to be sufficient depth of soil. And the rocky ground maybe represents the individual who just receives the teaching in a very shallow way. Maybe not as shallow as the one who just takes what is heard and then just repeats it as though the meaning was contained in the word. In the case of the seeds that fall on rocky ground, the person has only a little soil, but very minimal effort, very minimal engagement, and thus nothing will grow there. And some seeds then fall on among thorns, but they are choked out. And we get the sense that the mind is cluttered. The mind has so distracted that when the person hears the teaching, nothing can grow because there's no room in the mind. We see this all the time today. When people are constantly looking at their cell phones or have headphones covering their ears, listening to music, or they're multitasking, they're on the laptop and they're watching television and they're listening to music. And they're talking on the phone all at the same time. And you just get the sense there's no attention being paid to any particular task. And one might feel that way sometimes when one is at a party or one is at an event where things are really loud. It's very hard to have a meaningful conversation with another person because there's just so many things going on, and nobody is really listening to what you have to say. It's just a lot of the time small talk and babble, by people who are wearing masks, and they're just playing a role of, wanting to talk about something, even though the moment they leave the party, it's just going to disappear. Very, very hard to make an impact, a meaningful impact in that kind of environment. So nothing grows, but when seed falls on good soil, then we get growth that is really amazing. There's fruit everywhere, and it reminds me of the parable of the kingdom of heaven, which I discussed in a prior video, where from one seed you get a giant tree, and the birds come and they start singing and nesting in the branches and so on. There's life. It draws life. Now, the parable of the sower can be read as, why Jesus speaks in parables. He speaks in parables in order to force the individual to engage with what he or she hears, and not just to receive it and be able to repeat it without any understanding. So parables force the person to think. Parables distinguish between saying and meaning. And demand interpretation. And so this is Jesus's favorite mode of communication because he wants to engage with the individual. And so the parable is an explanation for why he speaks in parables, but the disciples don't understand that. And they ask, why do you speak in parables? And Jesus's reply is fascinating. Jesus says, I'm going to jump to verse number 13. He says, the reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing, he quotes here, seeing, they do not perceive, and hearing, they do not listen, nor do they understand. And he quotes the book of Isaiah. Chapter 6, verses 9 to 10. He says, with them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen, but never understand. And you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing. And they have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and understand with their heart, and in turn, I would heal them. Now, let me talk about this for a moment because it's a very profound response that Jesus gives. The reason I speak to them in parables, quote, is that, quote, seeing they do not perceive and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. Okay, so I speak to them in parables because if I didn't, then seeing, they would be able to see what I am saying, but they wouldn't understand. They would be able to hear what I understand, but they would be able to hear what I'm saying, but they wouldn't understand. So seeing, they do not perceive, listening, hearing, they do not understand. Why? Because if people are told things in a way that does not require their own thinking, their own engagement, their own effort, then things will never be understood. The individual has to be involved and engaged in and engaged with what he or she is hearing. So what the parables do is they force this kind of engagement and effort. Simply because the parables come in the form of stories whose meaning is not transparent through the letter or immediate narrative. And that's why we have metaphors. If I say, for example, that my love is like a red, red rose, one thing my love is not is like a red, red rose. It's not perishable. It's not going to decay. It's not just here for a couple of weeks. What I mean when I say my love is like a red, red rose is the opposite of what I am saying at a literal level. And so I am communicating the opposite of what I am saying at a literal level. What I want to communicate is that my love will last. It's imperishable. It is not here only for a couple of weeks. It will endure. It's not like a red rose at all. And so what the metaphor does is it communicates an unnatural meaning to the natural image. The natural image is of a rose that perishes. The meaning is unnatural. It refers to that which does not perish. So this is what Jesus says initially. And then he says the following: with them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. Again, this is verse number 14 now. I've read this already. And now he cites Isaiah. You will indeed listen, but never understand. And you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, so that they might not look with their eyes and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. And turn, I think previously I said an intern, and turn, and I would heal them. There's so much going on here. The heart has grown dull. That's why people listen but don't understand. That's why they look but don't perceive. The heart is dull. The heart is lazy. The heart is weak. Heart, mind, it's weak. It doesn't engage with what is heard, but is simply received immediately. How do you sharpen the senses of receptivity? How do you sharpen the resonance of what one hears? By demanding effort, by making your meaning inaccessible at a merely literal level. How do you sharpen the muscles? How do you strengthen the muscles? By giving it resistance and by forcing it to overcome that resistance in the form of free weights or in the form of body weight or whatever. There has to be an overcoming of a resistance. So the parable is the resistance that the mind has to overcome, because it's not easy to understand what is being said, what is being communicated in what is being said. Now, the heart has grown dull, the ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes. And I mentioned in a previous video that we can use our eyes not to see, and we can use our ears not to hear. I use my eyes not to see when I simply look at somebody and make a judgment about that person based on that person's appearance. And I use my ears not to hear when I dismiss whatever I'm hearing if it's coming from somebody that I don't like. And that's what happens with people often. Dating apps are very easy because you can just swipe right or left. I don't know. I don't use them now, but you just swipe right or left based on a static pose or picture of an individual. Actually, it's a static pose of an individual whose outer surface is all that you see. It's not even the body that you are looking at, it's the surface of the body. The body would require your understanding of what's going on inside with the organs and the blood and the heart and the stuff that you would find measured in a lab report, whatever. So that's what we do. Um, and then Jesus says, after saying that they've shut their eyes, quoting Isaiah, they've shut their eyes so they might not see with their eyes, they listen or listen with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. To turn is to repent. It means to turn towards God. The Hebrew word for repent comes from the word to turn. I don't know what word is used here in Hebrew. I don't speak Hebrew, but you get the sense that um, the, the dull heart comes to life when it repents. The heart that is dull to its own sins, the one who is blind to, deaf to the wrongs that he is doing in the world. The only healing is turning towards God, changing how you think and how you live at the deepest possible level, acknowledging the wrong, making whatever reparations is one can make to the extent that it helps, it can repair the wrong. Some wrongs are irreparable, as I mentioned in my previous video on, I can't remember exactly which one now, but the the turning, the repenting is not a repentance by saying I'm sorry, it's by being sorry. And being sorry means actually changing how you think and how you live at the most fundamental level, which is the hardest thing that one can do. Now, Jesus then explains the parable, and what he will say is consistent with what I have said. But before turning there, I want to look at what is said in the Gospel of Mark, because you also have a parable in the Gospel of Mark, a parable of the sower in the Gospel of Mark, which is more or less the same as you find in Matthew. But what Jesus says after he says the parable is different. Here, we know, we have just seen, is that Jesus speaks in parables so that they will perceive and understand. I speak to them in parables because seeing, they don't perceive, hearing, they don't understand. So I speak to them in parables so that they will see and understand. Well, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verse number 12, Jesus says the opposite. But it's the complement to what he says in Matthew. And he says in Mark, for those outside, everything comes in parables. This is verse number 11, verse number 11 and 12 onwards. For those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that, quote, they may indeed look, but not perceive, and may indeed listen, but not understand. So here, I don't know if that comes from any part of the Hebrew scriptures. If it does, there would be a reference here. But I don't think it does. So what Jesus is saying here is that I speak in parables so that they will not understand. They will look but not perceive. They will listen but not understand. So Here, he speaks in parables in order not to be understood. But that complements what he said in Matthew, because the road to understanding passes through misunderstanding, or at least the risk of misunderstanding. It passes through the it passes through difficulty. We have to think, we have to engage, we have to work hard, and not simply take what is given to us at the surface and make the judgment that that's all there is, because then we will fall into misunderstanding for sure. So to understand requires the risk of not understanding. And that's why when you speak in parables, it's a very dangerous mode of communication. It's a very risky mode of communication, because when you demand interpretation, then you open the doors to the possibility of misinterpretation. Whereas 2 + 2 = 4, you can't go wrong with that because it's clear and transparent. But when you start speaking in parables, or in general, when you start using metaphors, or you start using symbols, or you start using in a deeper level of communication, a layered level of communication, a nuanced level of communication, a level of communication that demands that the hearer actually does something to understand, rather than presenting everything that you want to say on a PowerPoint slide, or in sound bites or whatever. That kind of way of communicating will result in a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of people who take what you have said and go down a different path, which is what has happened actually in the Bible generally, in both the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament writings. There has been so much abuse, and the writings have been tortured to such an extent that in many ways the scriptures have become interpreted as teaching what we find in the non-biblical world, where we have a God that is, uh, the master, and human beings as being the slave, and there's no relationship between them, where the human being suffers what God gives them as though God was fate, and the human being was just a plaything, a reactive plaything of powers that he doesn't know or understand, and can never know or understand. Whereas what the teaching of the gospel is the complete opposite, is I've tried to express in the videos that I've produced so far. Now, we are ready to see what Jesus says about the parable. So this is how he explains the parable himself. He says in Matthew chapter 13, verse 18, picking up where I left off a while ago, "Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches it away, so nothing grows. This is what was sown on the path. There's no root. The individual doesn't understand what he hears, so nothing lasts. He will forget. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. So the person who has no root, again, can't understand the word, which endures only for a while. And then because the person has immediately received it, it immediately falls away. When I was growing up, I was studying martial arts for a time. And it took a very, very long time for me to pass through the white belt into the yellow belt. But there were studios where people would go and a week later they would get a yellow belt. I was at the training area once, just outside, not far from my home. And there was an older gentleman, maybe about 65 years old, and he was amazingly flexible and he was amazingly strong there. And I asked him, how did you keep your body in such good condition? He was doing the splits and he was just very strong with the exercise he was doing. And he said, well, he was training in Ukraine as a judo. He was training judo in the Ukraine. And it took him 3 years, he said, to get from white belt to yellow belt. 3 years. Well, over here, where I live in Toronto, there are some studios that will give it to you very easily, right? But there's no root. There's no real learning. It's the same thing with university. There are courses that people can take at university that demand nothing, but they demand nothing because they offer nothing. And these days, students can go through the whole undergraduate program and they can come out virtually illiterate without any understanding even of how to read. There are some students who brag that they have never read a book throughout their university. So they paid money for an empty education, an education that had no standards, an education that didn't demand anything of them, an education that didn't offer them anything. For what? For a piece of paper that makes it appear like they learned something, but they haven't. And during the time in which they will be tested, what's going to happen? As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. Again, the individual is so distracted that what one hears doesn't take root. One doesn't have the attention span even. It's just so common today. Doesn't even have the attention span. The shorts on YouTube or the pictures on Instagram. I mean, they're just flashpoints, but it's just moving to a baser and baser level where less and less is required of the individual who is watching or seeing something. Things are becoming easier and easier, but shallower and shallower proportionally. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, in another 30. And then shortly after this, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. Good seed in good soil. The kingdom of heaven will involve understanding, not just pretending to understand, being able to repeat something as even the devil can do. We've seen in the previous video on the devil's encounter with Jesus, but understanding it and living it. My name is Mohammed Kimji. Thank you very much for your attention, taking the time out of your day to listen. And if you'd like, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Till next time.